In 2002, the wrestling business was changing in many varied ways. By February, the WWF, in its last few months of being called that, would reintroduce the NWO, and was soon to enter a new era, one of ruthless aggression. While NWA TNA was in its planning stages, Ring of Honor would hold their first event. I wanted to look into the creation of ROH, but there's a book coming out hopefully soon called Code of Honor that I hope does a better job of that than I can. Not an ad, by the way. Instead, I thought I'd look at the two wrestlers who are perhaps most synonymous with the letters ROH, and what their careers were like before the era of honor began, because there was more to it than I at first knew. In this video, we'll look at the early careers of Mark and Jay Briscoe. We'll look at why Ring of Honor was the place that really got them noticed. Then we'll look at the timeline starting before their first professional match to ROH's first show. The era of honor begins. If there's something in this video that you didn't know, let me know about it in the comment section. And also tell me your favourite Ring of Honor memory. While Ring of Honor wasn't the first place where the Briscoes worked, it was likely the company that got them the most early exposure to a wider audience. Before I get into them specifically, it's worth taking a minute to explore what set Ring of Honor apart from the very beginning. In the December 10th, 2001 edition of the Wrestling Observer, Dave Meltzer would lay out the plans that were in place for ROH's first card in February. All that was known at the time was the date and location, February 23rd at the Murphy Rec Center, which is half a mile away from the ECW arena. Not going to the more famous venue is an interesting choice, but one that made a lot of sense for the new company. At the time, there were already other promotions competing to be the next ECW, in what is now known as the 2300 Arena. XPW was a frontrunner, going as far as to attempt to rename the building in a press release. Other companies who were also running the former Viking Hall were Combat Zone Wrestling and Propane Pro Wrestling, which was run by ECW alumni Blue Meanie and Jasmine St. Clair. 3PW wasn't even the only Philadelphia-based group run by a former ECW wrestler, as Steve Corino would start up the Pennsylvania Wrestling Federation. Having run his first show in March, he would sell it off by August, and the company is actually still going in 2026, known as the Premier Wrestling Federation. Ring of Honor not going to the ECW arena gave them two things to their advantage. It was a smaller venue and therefore would likely have cost less, and it set Ring of Honor apart from all the hardcore promotions that were vying to be the new kings of the ECW arena. The Murphy Rec's capacity was about 400, as supported by claims after the first night that the show sold out with this figure, while the ECW arena could host roughly 3 times that. Ring of Honor would eventually run the ECW arena, then known as the New Alhambra Sports and Entertainment Center, in 2006, on the same day as CZW. Their show Arena Warfare, as well as CZW's When Two Worlds Collide, furthered the ongoing feud between the two companies. From the very beginning, Ring of Honor had one more advantage that a lot of other indies at the time didn't, and it was perhaps their biggest one. The promotion was born out of RF Video, an established video distribution company. As Dave writes, they can sell their tapes and merchandise at the shows, and can make money by bringing in hot indie matches for their tape clientele, and selling the tapes of matches with guys like American Dragon, Spanky, Loki, Guerrero, etc., whose names won't sell tickets but will have great matches. RF Video's online business could potentially go up based on the ROH wrestling shows, and the revenue made from the shows could be boosted by selling RF Video tapes at them. It also had a benefit for independent wrestlers, making ROH a place where many wanted to work. A company with far-reaching distribution was going to be able to expose wrestlers to a wider audience than other indies that couldn't. If you wanted to get your name out there, you wanted to be in Ring of Honor. Now let's take a closer look at the Briscoes, two of ROH's most successful stars, but how homegrown were they? It's well established folklore at this point that Jay and Mark were there from day one, but Mark was too young to wrestle at the very start. What you might not know though, is that Mark and Jay had been wrestling for nearly 2 years by the time the Era of Honor began, and were promising talents from the start. The two would train at the Delaware-based ECWA school known as WrestleTech, before moving on to CZW's training school later on. On May 20th, 2000, Jay and Mark would have their first professional match for ECWA. They would team up against the excellently named Mozart Fontaine and Mr. Ooh La La. Jay was 16 years old at the time, and Mark was 15, making them still high school students. While there's no full record of this show online, Mark says in an episode of AEW Stories that the Briscoes began their careers in Wilmington, Delaware, roughly 30 miles away from Philadelphia, where the two would really begin to make names for themselves. Because of a push by the State Athletic Commission to regulate extreme wrestling in New Jersey, CZW would venture out into neighbouring state Delaware, which would work out very well for the still young Briscoes. They would make their first appearances for Combat Zone Wrestling in January 2001. The first time that the Briscoes caught the attention of the newsletters came in May 2001, for 2 of their recent CZW matches. Most were raving about Mark and Jay Briscoe, 2 high school kids, 16 and 17 respectively, who worked against each other and did every big move in the book to an incredible performance. The match that Dave's referring to is part of the first ever Best of the Best tournament. He adds that he received more than one report calling their match against each other the best indie bout of the year. And when you consider who else was on the indies at the same time, the likes of AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, CM Punk and many more, that's very high praise. Dave would further elaborate. People rave about how good these two are considering their age and their limited pro experience, but also worry that they may injure themselves because of how many risks they take before making it. They're actually really crisp in the ring, as opposed to what you'd think of acrobatics with bad transitions from flying indie guys. When Dave says that they pulled out every big move they could, he's not exaggerating. I'm certainly not qualified to critique a wrestling match, and I'm not going to here, but I am going to present you with a list of devastating looking moves that are done starting from just a few minutes in. A tombstone piledriver, a splash from an ungodly height, one of those gnarly DDTs like how RVD takes a piledriver, a J-driller about halfway in, a Northern Lights off the top, a powerbomb, and they finish off with a J-driller from the top rope. All of this might well come from the brothers' own admission that they essentially spent their childhoods wrestling each other in the backyard, because despite all of those moves, it feels like you're watching 2 people who trust each other 100%. In the 2025 documentary 2 in 1, The Briscoes Story, Mark says that his earliest memories involve wrestling Jay. You learned how to crawl, then you learned how to walk, then you learned how to wrestle with your brother. He shows some home movies of the two wrestling in their yard from as late as August 99, less than a year before they began wrestling professionally. They can be seen grappling on a trampoline and even in their own ring, which I assume was built by Papa Briscoe, who might also have been this referee. Mark and Jay's mother tells a story of the two watching wrestling tapes, then going out into the yard to recreate what they saw, and even filming themselves and watching that back to critique it. This method of self-training might explain why they seemed so advanced beyond their early careers. A week after Dave first wrote about the Briscoes, he would have a lot to say about a 6-man tag that they'd recently had, teaming with Rick Blade against the Amazing Red and the SAT. That match was excellent. I don't know how anyone could knock guys who had so little time in the ring putting on matches of this caliber. He seems to concede that their style is a bit, what I guess we'd call politely, indie-rific, but he also makes note of an important detail, that what they were doing, the crowd was enjoying, which is certainly not to be ignored. Whatever style weaknesses they may have by doing spot after spot, almost Michinoku Pro style, is more than made up for by the crowd enjoying it, and it's amazing how solid they are with most of their stuff. All 6 guys were really impressive. Remember when I quoted Dave earlier saying that some fans were worried that the 2 young men would hurt themselves before making it? At one point in this match, the Briscoes and Blade attempt what the commentator calls a 3-story superplex, where Mark sits on Jay's shoulders, who is already on Blade's, and suplexes Red off the top rope. This already sounds quite insane to begin with, but Mark backflips with Red and takes a scary looking fall headfirst towards the mat. Thankfully, and somehow, Mark Briscoe is still going 25 years later, mind. On July 14th, 2001, the Briscoes would defeat Hate Club, Nate Hatred and Nick Gage for the CZW Tag Team titles. This is, as best I can tell, the very first championship either Briscoe would ever hold, and the first of 28 tag team championships across many different companies. While this reign would only last 2 weeks before they lost the titles again, they would go on to have many, many more runs with gold. Shortly before Ring of Honor started up, despite their young ages, the Briscoes had even completed one short tour of Japan. The 2 would wrestle 5 matches for Big Japan Wrestling, as part of an interpromotional feud between them and CZW, 2 companies who specialised in violent matches. It sounds, according to a fan letter sent into the Observer, like Jay and Mark didn't participate much in the violence though. Briscoes didn't really seem to get over, as they wrestled more of a mat-based style than a high spot fest. That's not to say though that they didn't take part in some ultra-violence in the US, as the match where they won the CZW Tag Team titles was criticised for the 2 young brothers using light tubes and such. A few days after returning to the US, Mark and Jay would come back to CZW for a show in the ECW arena, but not as you might expect. They would wrestle as Kenny and Keno Murdoch, the Midnight Outlaws with a Z, so you know they meant business. This was no doubt a reference to another famous Midnight Rider. It's that must be 18 to wrestle rule, which is selectively enforced based on all the unsavoury elements that make commissions regulating wrestling such a farce. Alpha Jr. worked his first match at the age of 13. The idea is that the rules don't have to be enforced if the higher-ups at the commission don't know who is under the mask. At the time, Jay was 2 weeks from turning 18, while Mark was a little over a year away, and both had been wrestling for nearly a year and a half, just not in Pennsylvania. They had actually begun wearing the masks at CZW's previous ECW arena show, Cage of Death 3, and would have to a couple more times before they could go back to the names they would become better known using. In December 2011, Ring of Honor uploaded to their YouTube channel a promo by Jay and Mark Briscoe that was filmed on their chicken farm. It was a rant largely about how they had received WWE tryouts, only to be told that they weren't, quote, cosmetically pleasing enough to be hired. It was done to build a match at Final Battle 2011 against former WWE stars Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas. I didn't realise until making this video, but one of the Briscoes' earliest ever feuds was with Charlie and his late brother Russ. I don't know where it landed with other fans, but it's one of my all-time favourite promos, because Jay in particular feels like he means every vitriolic word. In it, Jay makes an aside that gets passed by quite quickly. He mentions WWE Developmental, which would have been FCW at the time, and says, yeah, you got some good ones, mainly the people from ROH, but the majority of them weren't even really that nice. By that point, Bryan Danielson and Seth Rollins had gone, as well as the Kings of Wrestling, all great opponents for the Briscoes. It sometimes doesn't get mentioned just how many ROH stars passed through CZW first. From the likes of Brody Lee, Kevin Steen and El Generico, to Chris Hero, Claudio Castagnoli, and later on, Adam Cole. The Briscoes are also on that list, and were likely noticed by ROH there, as some of the early CZW shows have an RF video graphic at the start of them. This was another advantage that Ring of Honor had. RF Video had filmed and produced events for other companies, and so had already been able to see up-and-coming talent firsthand. Just 2 weeks after they would appear in CZW as the Midnight Outlaws with a Z, Mark and Jay Briscoe would be at the Era of Honor begins, and the rest, as they say, is history. I've talked before on this channel about Ring of Honor's importance over the years in building talent that became stars elsewhere, but this video is partly about the other indie promotions who also fostered talent who went on to bigger things. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.